Ladies and gents, I am joined here today by Dr. Professor Sam Vaknin, finally. And we're going to be going through some of Sam's more recent ideas and models that are going to be very, very useful. They could be game-changing, possibly, in terms of understanding. If people take it on, it will be game-changing. In terms of understanding personality disorder and the dynamics of narcissistically abusive relationships, the implications of which are essential for recovery. Without understanding this, recovery is going to take a much, much longer time. As I ask you questions, Sam, I am going to have to be slightly annoying, and I'm going to keep
You're always annoying.
Oh, okay, so it's normal.
It's nothing new.
Nothing new. And I'm going to keep trying to make sure that we're at the level that a 16-year-old student, not to patronize the audience, it's so that it's easier for them. These are hard concepts, aren't they?
They are, and faculty members in very prestigious universities told me they had difficulty.
They also struggled.
No patronizing, indeed.
Okay. So I'll speak on the behalf of the audience members. Any time I hear something that I think needs padding out,
sure,
I will.
Sure,
I will
feel free. I'll just walk out the room.
Yeah, you'll be gone, but
I'll
it's
be gone.
fine.
You can continue.
Before we get into the models themselves, what is could you just let people know what the backstory to this, the history of this, because obviously this isn't something that it's new to them, but it's been cooking for, I don't know, a decade.
Well over. Well, it's been cooking for about 6 or 7 years in my head,
Okay.
but it harks back to the very beginnings of psychology, when we had psychoanalysis, and then we had psychoanalytic psychology, and then we had object relations schools, a multiplicity of schools.
Yeah.
The most prominent of which were in the United Kingdom, shockingly.
Amazing.
So yes, I mean, God works in mysterious ways. And so, what has happened in the 90s, 80s even, 90s, is that psychology developed pretensions to science.
Yeah.
Psychology decided that they are the physicists of the mind.
Yeah.
Mind you, Freud had the same delusion. He considered the mind an object which can be analyzed, and that's why, hence psychoanalysis.
Right.
It was a mechanics of the mind. He
Yes.
thought of himself as a Newton of the
Yes.
mind. We'll leave this aside for a minute, but the result of this, it drove psychologists to drop everything prior to 1980.
Okay.
So it's been eliminated from curricula. You can't study psychoanalysis at in any Western university. You can't study object relations in any. And if you try to introduce it to your students, they snigger and mock you.
So just to back that up, at university, when I studied at university, if I mentioned Freud or
Yes.
Jung or psychoanalysis,
Yes.
the lecturers either mocked me or they became angry.
Yes.
And I've tried telling this, they
Yes.
don't believe me.
And this has been ongoing to this very day.
Yeah.
So the entire history of psychology prior to 1980 had been erased, very similar to the Stalin era,
Yep.
when they were air touching, you know,
Yeah. Airbrushing
characters out of photographs. And we have discarded the bathwater with the baby, with the bathtub, and with the bathroom, and with the apartment.
Please come in. Please come.
Feel free.
Thank
This is
you.
the most important part of the interview.
Yes. It's very Freudian. The coffee represents sustenance from the mother.
Yes, sustenance from the mother. The
narcissistic
waiter
supply.
represents the father.
The invasion of the private space.
Space. Exactly. Yeah. So we have discarded, as I said, the baby with the bathtub, with the bathwater, with the bathroom, with the apartment.
And it's a strange. It feels political. It's a strange effect, isn't it, where we try to erase the.
Yes.
Because Freud is the foundations of our psychology.
Freud is the foundations of understanding the human spirit, and I think discarding all these accomplishments was a serious mistake. So I went back to all this period, and I derived certain insights which I've adopted. But my work relies on recent discoveries in neuroscience, actually.
Okay. So it's rooted in the past and
Yes.
very much in the present as well.
Yes, neuroscience fully supports literally everything I'm saying
Okay.
right now.
Okay.
Recent advances, recent discoveries in neuroscience. And I think what will happen ultimately is that neuroscience will revive psychoanalysis, will lead to the revival of psychoanalysis and object relation schools.
Okay.
By the way, most neuroscientists would agree, I think, if we were to introduce them to psychoanalysis and object relations.
Thank you.
They just have never come across it. But
Yes.
I think
so neuroscience could rehabilitate the field.
So.
Yeah.
I think so. Anyhow, coming to my work, it's been in the making for 6 or 7 years. Actually, you and I have had an interview, I think 4 years ago or something.
Yeah.
Where I mentioned internal objects and the role of internal objects in borderline, and so it was the inception of the whole thing. Now, if you wish, I can delve straight in. And
yes.
You're the boss.
This is where I'm going to try and listen naively, and when I hear things that I think will trip people up, I'll ask you to pad it out. I hope it's not too annoying.
No, come on, it's perfectly okay. I'm here to try to make sense of the thing.
Yeah,
don't worry.
Because if it's a great, I'm saying model. Do you call it a model?
It's a model.
It's a model. I think it's a fantastic model. But like anything, if it's a wonderful invention, a fantastic model, and nobody knows about it, it's as though it doesn't exist.
As long as I know about it, everything's okay.
Well, then, as long as
I don't really care about it.
God
Who cares about other people? Yeah. So, would you like me to maybe start with some? Yeah. The idea was to try to make sense of personality disorders in general, more specifically cluster B, and within cluster B, mostly borderline and narcissism. Yeah. The reason I focused on borderline and narcissism goes back to Otto Kernberg, who had suggested that narcissistic disorders of character are the foundation of most mental health problems. So if we understand disturbances in narcissism, we would probably find a theory of everything.
I didn't know that.
When it comes to...
This is Kernberg's idea.
Yeah, he said that, for example, borderline and narcissism are indistinguishable. They're both facets of transition between neurosis and psychosis, etc., etc. But he then connected it to schizophrenia, for example, in his work, and so on. And it became a theory of everything.
Okay.
It became a theory of everything, but it was in the 1970s. There was a lot of ignorance when it comes to the brain, to neuroscience, and so on. Psychoanalysis, object relations was falling out of favor. Yeah. Psychology was transitioning into the land of pretense, being a form of physics.
Yes.
So statistics took over, and now when you study psychology, by the way, you study about half the time statistics.
True. So all absolutely.
It's a bloody joke.
Yeah.
And again, I will not go into it. We've done, I think, something about it. So. Yeah. I focused on borderline narcissism. And then I asked myself a simple question. What is the main driver of narcissism and what is the main driver of borderline?
Right.
And I've reached a conclusion or a suggestion that there are two forces at play. The first force is the need to be seen.
Okay.
And the second force is what is called bed object internalization.
So you were in your imaginary laboratory and you were coming back to first principles. What are the driving forces behind borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, in their essence, in their simplest form?
Yes, in the simplest form. Narcissists want to be seen.
Yes.
It is true that they want to be seen because they need narcissistic supply, which helps them to regulate a sense of self-worth, etc., etc. And I can heap additional insights on this. But at the core, they simply need and want to be seen. They need and want to be seen not the way healthy people do. Yeah. Everyone wants to be seen and noticed, but compulsively. Yes. They can't help it. That's why I use the word drive.
Okay.
Drive in Freud's work was a compulsive thing, something you couldn't control, something which was that you needed to develop personality constructs to contain the drive.
Yes.
That's why we have a superego.
Yes.
A superego in Freud's work contains the id. The id is a drive. The id is a drive to have sex, honestly. So the superego controls this. So in Freud's work, there is a level which is compulsive and utterly out of control. And people develop, as they age, as they develop construct or structures superimposed on the drive in order to contain the drive.
Yes.
This is exactly narcissism. It's exactly what happens in narcissism.
So the primal force that creates, that drives the need to be narcissistic and to create a narcissistic personality disorder, and the same for borderline personality disorder, is instinctive, it's unconscious,
Yes.
it's pre-verbal, it really
Yes.
can't be reasoned with.
It can be controlled. Now,
Yeah.
you would develop a need to be seen if you're not seen.
Yes.
If as a child you're not seen and no one pays attention to you, you're neglected, you're abandoned, the mother is selfish, depressed, absent, physically sometimes
Yes,
absent.
yes.
She got sick, she went to a hospital for a few months,
Yes.
whatever. When you're not seen, of course, this would become a compulsion. For the rest of your life, you would need to be seen. Why is that? Because to not be seen as a child is to die,
Yes.
simply. It becomes a survival, issue of survival.
Yeah.
It becomes a coping strategy, which is intended to guarantee survival.
Yes.
So this is a need to be seen. The second force I've identified is what has already been identified. It's bad object internalization. It's simply, and I'm trying to explain.
You said the word simply. I know when people, because I've done this, when I've said bad object, or even just bad object without the internalization, the eyes, they glaze.
Yes. And to unglaze,
To unglaze.
unglaze eyes, I was about to explain that bad object internalization is when you're told as a child, or it's somehow communicated to you,
Yes.
behaviorally or otherwise, environmentally, or you're embedded in a culture where this is common, where children are denigrated or mocked, or,
Yes.
and so on, and there are such cultures. So, whatever the case may be, you internalize the belief that somehow you are unworthy,
Yeah.
somehow you are insufficient,
Yeah.
inadequate, broken, on the verge of losing your mind,
Yes.
fragile, vulnerable, etc., etc.
Who is the bad object?
You internalize other people's view of you as bad and unworthy,
Yes.
and it becomes an inner conviction.
I
You believe it.
Yeah.
You know, adhere to it.
I don't know how you could say it simpler than that. The bad object is you, and it's other people's perception of you that you have internalized. You, I don't know, unlovable piece of shit syndrome, or you see yourself as.
I've been told, I'm going to use a few personal examples,
Yeah.
if you don't mind this
Please.
one. Let's personalize it a
Yes.
little. I've been told throughout my childhood by my mother that I'm ugly.
Okay.
That I'm unbearably ugly. I mean, she went into details, she analyzed every feature of my anatomy and explained to me why it's utterly repulsive and ugly and so on and so forth. Well, of course, look at me and see that she was right. But that apart, that aside, I've internalized this bad object.
Right.
In other words, I came to believe her. I came to adopt her point of view. I came to adhere to
Yes.
her creed. I have internalized the perception or the self-perception that I'm ugly.
And sorry, you don't just mean an external physical ugliness, which is what she said. The child will generalize to, I am in essence ugly, toxic, unlovable.
Unlovable, simply. The bad object issue is about being unlovable. You can be unlovable because you're inadequate, you're a failure, you're ugly, you're stupid. Also a message
Yes,
that
yeah.
parents, you are selfish.
Yeah.
Parents can accuse you of being selfish, a form of
Yes.
emotional blackmail,
Yes.
etc. And you internalize this. This, however, should happen at a relatively early age.
To
internalize a
function.
bad object, you need to be exposed to constant messaging prior to age 6. These are called the formative years.
Yes.
If you've been exposed to this messaging until age 6, you end up having an internal bad object for life.
So if I want a child with narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, or a whole slew of other mental health issues, which I might, before the age of 6, I must consistently, overtly, and through suggestion, send them the message, you're worthless, you're ugly, you're stupid, you're
Then
annoying.
you're likely to get a borderline.
That way is a borderline.
But if you ignore the child, if you don't pay attention to the child, and you don't pay attention in a way that the child feels endangers him somehow. So if you do this, you're likely to get a narcissist.
Okay.
So these are two bad parenting strategies.
Yes.
Donald Winnicott described the good enough mother.
Yeah.
And his list, he made a list simply, how you should be a good enough mother. And his list includes both.
Okay.
But the outcomes depend crucially on what you do more.
Okay.
If you ignore the child more, become a narcissist. If you abuse the child more, likely to become a borderline.
As you said yesterday, if there was sexual and physical abuse, we're more likely to end up with a borderline child.
Yeah.
If it's more of a neglectful parenting style,
Yes. Absent, neglecting, you're likely to end up with a narcissist.
okay.
So when we say that narcissists are the outcome of trauma and abuse, we actually are talking about parents
Yeah.
who had refused to regard the child as a separate entity and therefore could not see the child.
Yes.
I mean, you can't see someone unless you acknowledge that they are separate from you.
Yes.
This is something people find difficult to understand. The very act of seeing someone allows them to separate. The minute I see you,
Yeah.
that means I recognize you as separate from me, as an external entity, external object, clinically speaking. If I don't see you, if I treat you just as my extension or my internal object or my luggage, you know, then I will not allow you to separate. So this is intimately connected to separation individuation, which we'll come to in a bit.
Okay, so if I don't afford, even as adults, I could interact with you in a way that is basically respectful, but in my interactions with you, it could be implicit that I don't really see you as separate to me.
Imagine everyone around here pretended that you don't exist, would look through you.
Okay,
After a few minutes, you will begin to feel that you don't exist.
yes,
You will begin to doubt your own existence.
within minutes.
Minutes.
Yeah.
You'll begin to doubt your own existence. You'll
Yes.
feel extremely uncomfortable.
Yes.
You'll begin to look around. You'll begin to try to engage in eye contact, to force an interaction. But if they all conspire to not see you, the invisible man, you would ultimately become invisible.
Interesting.
So the need to be seen has to do, therefore, with two issues: the threat, the perception of a threat to life
Yes.
as a baby. So you need to be seen, you need to be noticed,
To
be
be
fed,
fed and
be
sheltered.
sheltered.
Yeah.
So. And much later in life, after age 18 months, separation individuation. By not being seen, you're not allowed to become.
18 months separation individuation. What do you mean, Sam? I'm not part of my mother anymore. I ceased to breastfeed. I am separate. What do you mean?
That's what you think, dear. Separation individuation is a process that's been described by Mahler, Melanie Klein, and many others. Even though in faculties around the world it's not being taught
Yeah.
and utterly ignored, this is such such crazy behavior, because any mother would tell you that
Yeah.
this process is absolutely true and happens.
Yes.
It's reality.
Yeah.
Separation individuation is when the child, around age 18 months, and then much later as an adolescent, by the way, there's a second phase of separation individuation. But the critical one is in age around between 18 and 24 months. When the child develops grandiosity, narcissism, Jung explains how, through a process of introversion. We're not going into it right now. The child becomes a bit grandiose and is ready to take on the world, is ready to explore the world. The child undergoes a massive trauma when he realizes that he and his mother are not one,
Yeah.
that it's not a single entity, a unitary entity. There's a schism, there's a break. He suddenly begins to realize that mother is not him. Why does this happen, by the way? Because mother frustrates him.
Yeah.
He wants to breastfeed, she wouldn't. He wants her to stay in the room, she leaves the room. The frustration is external. The more the child is frustrated, the more he begins to realize that mother is not him, because how could he frustrate himself?
Yeah.
So he begins to form, there's a process of a breakdown of the universe.
So there's frustration with the mother, and then aggression, and then as that builds,
Yes,
it creates
so the frustration,
distance.
yes, the frustration creates aggression.
Yeah.
And the aggression leads to splitting.
Okay.
Splitting is when the child attributes all good qualities to the mother, all bad to himself, etc. We'll not go into it right now.
Sure.
It's also not relevant to the model.
Yeah.
But at some point the child realizes mother is not me, I'm not mother, so maybe there are other things out there.
Yes.
Let's explore.
Yes.
To take on the world when you're 18 months old, you need to be seriously grandiose.
Yeah.
And Freud calls it primary narcissism. It's healthy narcissism. And it stays with you for life. this healthy narcissism is a foundation of self-confidence and self-esteem. It allows you to regulate your sense of self-worth. So it's critical for everyone to be a healthy narcissist.
You're saying that everybody goes through a phase of narcissism?
Yes, absolutely. Twice.
Listen, Sam, I've watched a few YouTube videos. I just don't believe there's a thing called... Have you seen these comments that say there's no such thing as healthy narcissism?
Yes. In the absence of narcissism, at least the grandiosity component, you would of course be terrified to leave mother and take on the world.
Yes.
You need to feel godlike to be able to take on the world.
To have your grand plan.
Simply to say goodbye to mother and seek the world. This is the separation phase, where the child says goodbye to mother and explores the world. It's reflected in many folk tales, in many mythologies and so on, where the son bids farewell to his mother and father and goes out on a voyage and so on. So this is the separation phase, but the separation phase never works if the mother doesn't recognize the child as a separate entity. The mother needs to provide the child with a safe base. What does it mean, a safe base? It means the child goes out to the world and then comes back to mommy and is not punished for having dared to separate from mommy.
So if the mother, at 18 months, there's a mother, but she has a certain personality type, and she really likes having this pet. It's like a kitten. And then the kitten starts to become a cat, and she becomes frightened that the child will leave. She would punish the signs of aggression. She would punish the drive to walk away from her.
Yeah. She can constrain him physically. She can say, don't go.
Yes.
An anxious mother, for example, would find it very difficult to let the child wander off.
Yes.
Narcissistic mother would feel injured if the child were to abandon her and, for example, interact with another person.
Yes.
A depressed mother would simply be there and hold on to the child because that's the only source of comfort, etc. So these mothers don't allow the children to separate. And these children never separate, consequently, and they remain in the unitary phase, in the unitary mode, where mother and me are one. They are never allowed to separate. When you are not allowed to separate, you never become an individual. The precondition for becoming is separating.
Yes.
So this is separation individuation, which again we should come to a bit later. Because we are kind of jumping.
Yes, sure.
So these are the two forces. A borderline typically would...
Sorry, the two forces are to be seen
and
the two drives. To be seen, bad object, and internalization.
Yes. The problem with bad objects, to be seen is relatively simple. And narcissists are very primitive machines.
Yes.
They seek narcissistic supply, they get it, they're happy, they don't get it, they're angry or depressed, and so on. End of story. That's narcissism. Borderlines are much more complicated structures, psychodynamically. Why? Because the bad object is internalized and introjected. In other words, the bad object becomes part of you. To remind people, again, following in your footsteps. Bad object internalization means you came to believe that you're a bad object. Other people were telling you you're a bad object, you're unworthy, you're a failure, you're this, you're that, negative things, ugly, stupid, whatever, and you came to adopt this view of yourself. Why would a child do this? Because mother can never be wrong. Mother can never be wrong. If mother is wrong, it's life-threatening. Because she could feed you the wrong thing, or she could mistreat you somehow. So mother must always be right. Mother is godlike. So when mother tells you you're ugly, you have two options. You can say mother is stupid, she's wrong. But then if she's wrong about this, she might as well be wrong about giving you the wrong antibiotics or something. You will die. It's
extremely dangerous.
You can't even contemplate this, countenance this. So you're wrong. If she is right, then she's right about you being a bad object. You are the one who is defective and deformed. And so. Bad object internalization is therefore a much bigger problem than the need to be seen. There's a process called identification, first described by Freud, between the child and this bad object. They become one.
And is that true for borderlines and narcissists?
Yes, narcissists have a bad object. But the way they cope with the bad object is very different to the borderline. And I'm coming to that if you wish. So now we have a situation that we have two damaged children.
Yes.
Two hurt and harmed children. These are children who've been traumatized, who've been abused in a variety of ways. Parentifying the child, for example, instrumentalizing the child, pedestalizing the child. These are all forms of not allowing the child to separate, not allowing the child to form boundaries, not allowing the child to become his or her own person.
Yes.
Personhood is denied. So we have damaged children here, two. There are many other types, by the way. Codependents go through a separate process.
Sure.
Right now, let's focus on narcissism and borderline. There's good reason to believe that codependent is merely a mixture between narcissism and borderline. Excellent reason to believe this. And there's an even better reason to believe that all of them are post-traumatic conditions. So you're beginning to see the rudiments of a unifying theory.
Yes.
Okay, so the children, these two children, let's assume a family with two children. The mother is a dead mother. Dead mother is a phrase coined by Andre Green in 1978 to describe a mother who is not good.
Okay.
A bad mother. A bad mother is a dead mother.
So you have the good enough mother
and the
then
dead
you have
mother.
Dead mother.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
A dead mother is alive, but she's not a mother. She's a very bad mother.
Yeah.
So, and imagine there are two children in this family and both of them are damaged.
Okay.
One of them becomes borderline, one of them becomes narcissist. For simplification's sake. Okay. This never happens. A minority of children become
Right.
but okay.
Right.
But for simplification's sake, the children simply choose different strategies. They choose different strategies. Also, the treatment of parents. Parents don't treat their children identically. That's a myth.
Yeah.
It's an American myth, if I may add.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's a myth. Parents don't treat, first of all, parents do have favorite children. They do prefer certain children to others. They do find certain children more difficult than others.
Yeah.
They do reject certain children and adopt others.
Yeah.
And so it's very likely that one of these two children in this imaginary family would be neglected and abandoned and ignored and rejected. Whenever he tries to approach, he would be rejected.
Yeah.
And the other one would be told that she's bad and helpless and a failure and ugly and stupid and what have you, unworthy. Okay. So of course the children will choose different solutions.
Yes.
So the child who is about to become a narcissist, his solution would be to actually create a world where he is seen. So he would solve the problem of being seen by creating what we call a paracosm. Paracosm is an alternative reality where he is seen. Initially, this is self-supply. The child creates an imaginary friend, which later becomes the false self. By the way, all children create imaginary friends. And children also have what we call transitional objects. A teddy bear, a pillow, a blanket with which they bond. The imaginary friend and the transitional object allow the child to experiment with relationships without the risk. The child has a relationship with the teddy bear. He has a relationship with an imaginary friend.
Right.
He then experiments. That's why dolls are very popular.
Yeah.
The girls play with dolls because that way they learn a lot about life. So everyone has an imaginary friend, but in the case of the narcissistic child, the role of the imaginary friend would be to see the child.
Yeah.
That's the main role of the imaginary friend. Gradually, this imaginary friend becomes the false self.
Okay.
He is everything the child is not. He is omnipotent, all-powerful, he is all-knowing, omniscient, he is perfect, he is brilliant, he is handsome, he is the smartest, and so on. Everything the child is not. This is the imaginary friend, but the main role is to see the child.
Right.
So this is the way the child solves the problem of not being seen, with this paracosm, with this
fantasy.
And exactly, and from the clinical point of view, it's a fantasy defense.
Okay.
The borderline also creates a fantasy defense. So both children decide to avoid reality.
Yes.
So reality has been painful and hurtful and unchangeable, immutable.
Yeah.
These children are powerless. They have no ability to affect the behavior of adults around them. So they retreat into fantasy. The borderline's fantasy is identical to the narcissistic child's fantasy, the borderline child's fantasy.
Yeah.
It's the same like the narcissistic child.
Okay.
Which tells me I'm on the right track. Because one of the core features of good science is parsimony. In other words, you use a minimal number of principles to obtain a panoply of phenomena, to describe a panoply of phenomena.
Okay.
And here I'm using actually the same thing over and over again, and it yields different outcomes.
Right.
So both the narcissistic child and the borderline child engage in fantasy.
Yes.
They do the same.
Yes.
Both of them have an imaginary friend. Both of them. Then the narcissist child's imaginary friend sees him. The borderline's imaginary friend, which also becomes a false self in due time. So both of them end up with a false self. The borderline's imaginary friend soothes her. It's about soothing, about comforting.
Okay.
So the borderline's imaginary friend kind of pats her on the head, tells her, you're a good girl, if she's a girl, you're a good girl, I love you, you're safe with me, etc., etc. This is the initial phase.
Whereas the narcissist's imaginary friend is saying, you're brilliant,
you're great,
wonderful,
you're wonderful,
great.
you're all-knowing,
So they both have a false self, they both have the desire to be seen. One is desirous to be seen through adulation, the other through more sympathy and compassion.
Yes, with the borderline it's less about being seen, but it's more about soothing. And comfort.
Okay.
Both of them have imaginary friends.
Okay.
Both of them have imaginary friends, which later, in both cases, become false self.
Okay.
It's identical developmental pathway. Just the job description of the imaginary friend is different.
Yes.
In both cases. One of them has to see and to notice the child, and the other one has to comfort the child and soothe the child. Of course, why would you need to be comforted and soothed? Because it creates regulation. When you're when you're comforted, when you're loved, when you're held, when you're contained, this creates regulation. And so the borderline learns to regulate her internal environment. She learns to regulate her emotions, her moods, even her cognitions. She learns to regulate everything inside her, all her internal processes, via the agency of the imaginary friend.
Right.
Same with the narcissist. The narcissist regulates his ego boundary functions. He regulates his reality testing, he regulates his sense of self-worth, he regulates his self-esteem, he regulates his anxiety. He regulates all this through the imaginary friend. Both children learn that nothing can come from the inside. They're emptied out. They're hollowed out. Nothing can come from the inside. Everything comes from within the fantasy. And the fantasy must include an agent, a third party, an imaginary friend.
When you say the narcissist and the borderline are both emptied out, what are they emptied out of?
Functionality. Nothing, no function is carried out internally. No process happens internally. Everything comes from the outside. Freud and others, they spoke in terms of ego functions. Of course, no such thing as ego. No one caught an ego. No one spoke to an ego recently, at least, unless one is a politician. So, the ego doesn't exist, but it's a useful metaphor. I always thought it was a useful metaphor, and I didn't understand why it had to be discarded. But among other things, Freud and many others afterwards, you like Adler. Adler did the same, although Adler emphasized aggression rather than sexuality. But they all talked about the functions of the ego. Ego has functions. Ego is an internal thing, and the functions of the ego are internal. But in the case of the narcissist, the functions are outsourced.
What would be a common ego function? What is assuming
reality testing, for example?
Reality testing, for example. So here's me. I have a semi-functioning ego, and I want to do some reality. What is reality testing?
Reality testing is the ability to perceive reality properly, in a nuanced way, and without too much deviation from facts.
Okay, so I have a functioning ego. My ego, permitting the model, allows me to do relatively good reality testing. I have a reasonable grasp on reality. You're saying if I'm a narcissist or a borderline, I have to recruit you to
You have to recruit initially an imaginary friend.
Imaginary friend first.
Much later, another person.
And how would I coerce you into doing a reality testing for me?
You don't coerce me. You simply become my reality testing.
Okay.
If I'm a borderline, if I want to know anything about reality, I refer to you.
Okay.
I ask you, is it real? Do you think so too? Do you share my view? Otherwise it won't be real.
Okay, okay.
A narcissist would tell you, am I not a genius? Am I not brilliant?
Right. So it's just
So reality is testing reality. Yes.
a slightly different
Yes.
frame.
Narcissist wants to be seen.
Yes.
A borderline wants to be comforted and soothed.
Okay.
So they're going to ask you different questions, but these are different questions about reality. No healthy person will ask you, do you think I'm a genius?
Yeah.
No healthy person will ask you this.
Yeah.
But the narcissist would. No healthy person would constantly ask you, is this real? Do you agree with me?
Yeah.
Did I just see this?
Yeah.
Did I just see this? I mean, it's a very common question with borderline.
Yes. Yeah.
Did I just see this? Did this really happen now? I mean, like...
reminds me of my ex, and I found it exhausting completely because it was all day, every day.
Exhausting because you become part of the apparatus, become part of the machinery
Right.
of regulating her internal environment.
Right.
You become an extension of her mind.
Yeah.
Exactly as the narcissist uses you. Narcissist uses you as an extension of his grandiosity.
Yes.
She uses you as an extension of her regulatory environment.
And if I got tired and I didn't answer quickly enough or with enough energy and conviction, she'd get very agitated.
Of course,
and ask
frustration,
again and again and again.
aggression.
Yeah. So, back to the reminding myself that, if this was for smart 16-year-olds at that level, so this is the kind of question I would get back from 16-year-olds in school if I presented this. It would be, so the narcissist or borderline is empty. What happens to them on a desert island if they're left alone?
The borderline is likely to become suicidal.
Yeah.
And the narcissist is likely to lapse into the equivalent of psychosis.
Yeah. So one would simply try to cease living,
suicide, yeah.
and the other would come...
Would also cease existing.
But by becoming completely psychotic.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Most likely.
Okay.
Most likely.
Because they wouldn't have anybody there to fulfill their ego functions for
They
them.
don't exist without other people. In every possible psychological way, they don't exist without other people. End of story. That's not me, that's Kernberg.
Not to get... I don't want to sidetrack us, but does that disqualify it as a personality disorder?
In my view, these are not personality disorders.
Yeah, okay.
You can't... There's no absent personality.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a contradiction in terms.
So is this... Really, we're talking about sociological functions?
Really, we're talking about a post-traumatic condition that had destroyed any vestige of identity.
Okay.
So these are non-entities. These are walking, talking vacuums.
Right.
These are absences. These are black holes. I mean, we can use numerous metaphors.
And what we're saying
but personality, they're not.
They're not. So, and what we say, oh, that's a personality disorder. There's no personality there. What we're observing is a pattern of interactions, an abusive pattern of interactions that we can only see in group settings. We can't say it in isolation.
Yes, exactly. You can't see it without another person.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a group, but one more.
One more. Okay.
Exactly. We therefore can safely say that narcissism and borderline, and I mean, we can derive many other disorders from this, but narcissism and borderline at least are relational disorders.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering if it was going to be a culture-bound disorder, but no, it's a...
They also happen to be culture-bound, but only in the sense that narcissism is diagnosed more among men, and so there's a gender bias there.
Okay.
But more to the point, it's relational.
Relational.
It's relational. When there, for example, if the borderline or the narcissist were to be isolated, were to be, most of the manifestations of a disorder would vanish. There would be a total disintegration of the person, there would be psychosis, there would be attempted suicide and so on. But 90, if not 99% of all the manifestations of borderline, behavioral manifestations, will vanish. Because it's relational.
Right.
It's in relation to someone. By the way, the criteria themselves are relational.
Yes.
Even in the new model,
Yeah.
which is now incorporated in the text revision of the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, even there, about 80 or even 90% of the text is about interaction with other people.
Yes.
There is no other such disorder except schizoid.
Okay.
In schizoid personality disorder, it's defined as someone who avoids other people,
Sure.
even for sex. So it's also a relational disorder. And in the 60s, the prevailing view was that narcissism and borderline are schizoid disorders.
Okay.
And that's why they said that both disorders are founded on an empty schizoid core.
Okay.
So there are good grounds to believe that narcissism and borderline are manifestations of a deeper schizoid disorder, and in this sense have a lot a lot in common with schizophrenia, as Kernberg had suggested.
I know that some people would be confused by that.
I hope some people will be confused.
I think, if I've understood correctly, it would be, so people would say, but narcissists, you just said narcissists need people, borderlines need people, how could it be schizoid? The way in which they're relating to people is actually keeping people at a distance by instrumentalizing them.
There's a misunderstanding of schizoid.
Yeah.
There's a behavioral description of schizoid personality disorder.
Okay.
That's something else. I'm talking about a schizoid core, a schizoid organizing principle.
Okay.
Schizoid simply means that you had internalized a bad object.
Okay.
By the way, so schizoid disorder starts with internalization of a bad object.
Yeah.
And you have chosen to avoid all objects.
Ah.
So there's simply another solution.
Okay, okay.
It's simply another solution. But, for example, narcissists go a lot through schizoid phases. They have a lot of schizoid phases.
Yeah.
Narcissist doesn't get supply. He isolates himself. He becomes schizoid.
Yeah, yeah.
Similar, borderlines are similar. After a major trauma, rejection, humiliation, abandonment, they can go through a schizoid phase where they have no sex, they don't meet anyone, they become cat ladies or whatever.
So would it, like a deep loathing and distrust of humanity and then a choice to self-isolate, that would be schizoid?
There's a schizoid phase. But
I know what I am now. That's
great.
great.
A schizoid phase. You're like that because you've met me. So, what I've been trying to do for the sake of this interview, as opposed to what we did yesterday, is I'm trying to go chronologically.
Yes.
Yesterday I just described the model, but now I'm trying to convert it into a chronological progression.
I think it's better for people to understand it chronologically, yeah.
So now we're stuck at age more or less 4 to 6, and these two damaged kids, one of them is about to become a narcissist, and one of them is about to become a borderline. These two damaged kids have a fantasy. Each one has a fantasy of his and her own. In these fantasies there's an imaginary friend which will become the false self a bit later, or a lot later, become the false self. But the functions of the false self in the fantasies are different. With the narcissistic child, the function is to see the child, to notice the child, and to reassure the child that he is noticeable, that he is seeable, in other words, lovable.
Okay.
With the borderline, the main function of the imaginary friend is to soothe, to comfort, to regulate the borderline. As these children grow up, remember, they've never separated. They carry their mothers with them wherever they go.
Yeah.
The mother is introjected. The mother is become an internal object, a voice inside their heads, and they can never get rid of it, except with decapitation. So, what?
A solution is the solution.
The solution. I must cover all bases. So, when these children grow up, they begin to have object relations. In other words, they begin to play with peers. Later on, they begin to notice the opposite or the same sex, depending on sexual orientation. So there's a sexual dimension added. They begin to develop gender differentiation. So some of them become boys, some of them become boys and become girls. By the way,
yes,
this is socially conditioned. It's a performative act.
Becoming a boy and
becoming a boy and a girl is learned, is acquired. It's absolutely not grounded in biology. That's a myth. It's a performative role which you learn, which your parents teach you, society teaches you.
But biology doesn't have a determining factor in the cultural structure, or?
Of course, we have a tendency to educate people with vaginas to be girls.
Okay.
We have a tendency, but that's a culturally determined thing. Because, for example, there are cultures where people with vaginas fulfill what in Western cultures are pure male roles.
Okay.
Absolute. And that includes very primitive society, or backward societies, for example, Northern Albania. So, where women fulfill male roles.
Right.
So, this is socially and culturally determined. Anyhow, object relations means that the child is beginning to be exposed to other people, real other people, not imaginary. So the child ultimately starts to have interactions with other people. It could be peers, teachers, neighbors, I don't know. He's forced into the world. There's no way to avoid the world, regrettably. So he's forced into the world. This forced interaction with other people changes the nature of the fantasy. We need immediately to ask why. Why isn't the fantasy sufficient when other people are in, where other people are involved? Because other people push back.
Yeah.
Other people provide countervailing information. Other people disagree with you, criticize you, mock you, put you down, etc., etc. So reality intrudes. Reality refuses to collude with the fantasy. You need then to make a choice as a child. Again, to remind all of us, we are talking now about age 6.
Yeah.
The child has been abused, been traumatized, created a fantasy. Within the fantasy is an imaginary friend, and the imaginary friend sees the child if the child is about to become a narcissist, or comforts the child if the child is, and regulates the child if she's about to become a borderline. And now the child is thrust into reality, and reality does not comply. Reality does not collaborate. Reality doesn't corset you, doesn't pedestalize you, doesn't idolize you, doesn't idealize you. Reality is brute and harsh and nasty and short. Peers are cruel, teachers are insensitive, neighbors are I don't know what. And so it's a problem. It's a problem to maintain the fantasy. Huge amounts of energy go into maintaining the fantasy in the face of reality. At some point, a compromise needs to be struck because the child is faced with two alternatives: giving up on the fantasy altogether and integrating with reality, or retreating into the fantasy altogether and giving up on reality. Neither option is fully possible. Neither is fully possible. The child cannot go fully into reality because the child never separated. The child has never separated from the parent, from mother. So the child cannot go into reality fully because his internalized mother, the mother introject, won't allow him. Every time he tries to venture out into reality and to become a part of reality, the mother introject actually prevents the separation.
Because the mother introject always prevented.
Yes.
So the mother was the kind of smother mother that said, don't separate from me.
Don't separate.
Stay on the breast. Yeah. That's internalized as an introject. Yeah. Every time I try to individuate, grow up, go into reality, that mothering side of me says, no, come back.
You may be vaguely acquainted with the concept of conscience. Yes.
You know I'm from Liverpool, right?
Yeah, well, I said vaguely. What is a conscience? A conscience is an introject. You want to steal something, this voice tells you, don't do it. It's bad, it's wrong, don't steal anything. Well, not in your case, but
steal everything.
Steal everything. So it's the same with the mother introject. You want to separate, you want to develop friendships, you want to go out to the world, you want to be absent for 2 days, you want to go to a party, you want to sleep over, etc. The mother introject says, don't do it.
Yes.
It's wrong. Exactly like a conscience.
Sorry.
By the way, a conscience is an introject.
Right.
It's one of the internal objects.
We both slip back into jargon a little bit. Superego injunctions, introject, conscience.
Introject is the representation of your mother in your mind.
Okay.
It's an internalized mother. It's like a small mini mother inside your mind, and she talks all the time, like all mothers do.
And the superego applies the introjects.
Superego is another model, not mine.
Okay.
Superego is another name for conscience.
Okay, another name for conscience.
In my work, the mind is populated with self-states.
Right.
One of the self-states is introjects, like your mother's representation, your father's representation, influential peers, influential teachers, role models. They all create representations in your mind.
And they function as a sort of a moral guide?
Moral guide,
conscience.
Behavioral guide,
Okay.
etc. So you have, your mind is populated with representations of people who have been significant in your life.
Introject is representations of people who've been significant in your life?
Yes. And these introjects talk to you all the time.
Okay.
These are the voices that you hear when you're doing something wrong, or when you consult with yourself. When you ask yourself, should I do this? The introjects answer you.
Yes.
So you have a population of introjects.
They're largely unconscious, right? You can't consciously control introjects.
Of course not.
They unconsciously repeat.
Not only they're unconscious, but they are perceived as what we call ego congruent. In other words, they are perceived as part of you.
Yes.
You perceive them as you.
Yes.
You don't say, it's my mother talking to me now, rarely, but you say, You feel that it's you talking to you.
You would have to have done about 10 years of therapy to be like, oh, that's my mother's voice,
Yes,
to
actually,
recognize
yes.
and interject. Yeah.
One of the main things we should do in therapy is distinguish between authentic voices and interjects.
Yes.
Anyhow,
Okay.
coming back to the...
Yeah, yeah.
So there's an internal space.
Yes.
And there are what I call self-states. Self-states are internal objects. So the internal space is populated with internal objects. Some internal objects are introjects. These representations of significant others in your mind. Other internal objects are, for example, your conscience. Other behavioral scripts, sexual scripts, and
Okay.
so they're internal objects. Other internal objects are your self-states. So sometimes you're narcissistic, sometimes you're psychopathic, sometimes you're empathic. These are all self-states.
So if I don't have a personality with different bits and pieces inside of it, but I have self-states, would this be like the revolver on a pistol, and then I'm
No.
this self-state, this self-state, this
No, it's
self-state?
not random. It's determined by the environment.
Okay.
When the environment provides you with information, cues, it's called cues. The environment provides you with information, cues, and these cues trigger your self-states.
So pretend there's four.
If you find yourself among criminals right now,
Yes.
all of us are violent criminals,
Yes.
you will have a psychopathic self-state coming out.
that comes forward to
Comes
protect
forward.
to protect me.
Yep.
So if I only have a limited number, 4 or 5 self-states, the different environments I go into trigger the
Determine.
necessity for determine, sorry, not
Determine
trigger.
what, what self-state will come out.
So rather than a personality as such, I have.
Assemblage of self-states.
Oh, you mean like alters? This is dissociative identity.
No, it's not alters. It's not alters. It's not alters because the self-states share memories.
Yes.
They have common databases.
Yes. They're associated. They're not
They're
disassociated.
associated, not dissociated.
Yeah.
They've shared databases, and
Yes.
this is what used to be called identity.
Okay.
And these shared databases are your identity. One of the shared databases is a database of memories.
Yes.
So they share memories. Another database that is shared is your emotional states. Another database is your cognitions. So these are databases, and they are shared by all the self-states.
The ideas that you are proposing now for the personality disorder model, are they dependent on the self-states model? Are they all part of the same model?
It's complicated to answer this.
Okay.
Healthy people have these self-states and so on. By the way, just to clarify, to give credit where it's due, the self-state model was not developed by me. It was developed by Philip Bromberg.
Okay.
I've just adapted it. I took it a long way off the original, but still, the credit goes to him.
Okay.
All people have self-states. The concept of personality, a unitary self, is antiquated, counterfactual, and very German, if I may add. It's hierarchical, it's disciplinarian, you can see
it's
the culture,
rigid.
Rigid, you can see the cultural influence. I'm kidding you not. So it's wrong. Also, it's wrong. Any psychologist would tell you it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's just there's too much money invested in the idea of self. There are textbooks, there are teachers.
Well, you undo everything. All your personality
It's
disorders.
like starting from zero.
Yeah,
from
if we go from self-states from personality, all your personality
But
disorders.
any psychologist, any therapist will tell you it's nonsense.
Yeah.
No one has a unitary, fixed, core, immutable self.
Yes.
This is total nonsense. People are like a river. They're not like a pond. So there are these self-states. Now, the reason I said that the answer to your question is complicated, because everyone has self-states.
Yes.
Healthy people, sick people, pathological people, everyone has self-states. But with a narcissist, there is a complication as usual. In the borderline, there are complications when it comes to the self-states.
Yeah.
And if you want, I will include this in the conversation a bit later when we come to it.
Okay.
We are again jumping the gun.
Yeah.
Okay, so now the child is exposed to other people, and other people don't treat him like mommy and daddy, and and so reality is harsh. And he has two choices. He can get rid of a fantasy, or he can get rid of reality. But actually, these choices are imaginary. He doesn't have these choices. Why? He cannot choose reality. Because to choose reality means to be an individual, to make decisions for a separate entity that can venture out. But these children, the proto-narcissist and the proto-borderline, these children cannot go out to reality because they have a mother interject that tells them, don't do it, it's wrong, don't separate from me. It could be emotional blackmail. If you separate from me, I will die. It could be, if you separate from me, you're a bad object, you're a bad boy, you're a bad girl. It could be, if you separate from me, you will fail. You will never succeed because you're ugly, you're stupid, you I don't know what. But whatever it is, there is a voice inside you that tells you, don't separate. How can you go out to reality if you are not separate from mommy? You can't. The answer is you can't. So the child doesn't really have this choice. On the other hand, the child cannot maintain the fantasy in its pure form because it's constantly attacked by reality. It's too much information that the child has to suppress and deny and repress and reframe. It's a full-time job. It's a bloody mess. He can't do this.
If you were God and you were all-powerful, why did you just get splashed with mud by the bus that went past?
For example.
Yeah, well, whatever, whatever. It's constant narcissistic injury.
It creates, in other words, it creates dissonance.
Yeah.
Reality, when the child is finally exposed to object relations, in other words, when the child is exposed to other people, this creates in him enormous dissonance.
Yeah.
And the dissonance is ongoing every minute of every hour of every day. This is an intolerable state because dissonance creates anxiety.
Yeah.
So that the proto-narcissist and the proto-borderline have a fantasy. As long as they were not exposed to other people, the fantasy worked. Then they're exposed to other people, and they transition into a phase of anxiety, overwhelming anxiety. And of course, anxiety, which is a form of frustration, creates aggression. They don't dare to externalize the aggression, so they internalize the aggression, they become depressive. Again, this was described actually by Melanie Klein. She called it the depressive phase in a much earlier stage, etc. I'm not going into it. Okay.
Because of bad breasts?
Yeah, in a much earlier phase of childhood, she said there's a depressive phase and there's also a schizoid phase.
Right.
I'm taking Melanie Klein's work and I'm stretching it kind of.
Okay.
I'm claiming that I think she had been wrong to attribute these phases only to a highly particular few months in early childhood. But I think it's characterizes childhood.
Yeah.
And definitely characterizes narcissistic and borderline pathologies. Because in narcissistic and borderline pathologies, the child never grows beyond the stage of 18 months.
Yes.
The child is 18 months forever. So Melanie Klein's work applies forever.
Yes.
Okay, so the child goes now to an anxious depressive phase because of this inability to get rid of a fantasy or to choose reality.
Catch-22.
Yeah. What's the solution? The first thing the child does, it fortifies its defenses. Obviously, the child becomes defensive. It fortifies the defense. The imaginary friend, which had very few functions, very well defined, and was kind of a friend, you know. Imaginary friend is separate from the child. When you talk to the child describes the imaginary friend as someone out there with its own name, its own physique, its own, you know. The child doesn't say the imaginary friend is me. So it's out there. Now, the child subsumes the imaginary friend, becomes one with the imaginary friend. It's a defense. Because the imaginary friend is God. It's a private religion, in effect. The child is creating a primitive religion. And the godhead of the religion is this imaginary friend, which now subsumes the child. Now, we know in primitive religions, people made human sacrifice. Right? This is human sacrifice. The child comes to the imaginary friend and said, you are God. I want to be God also. I'm going to worship you. I'm going to sacrifice myself to you. Human sacrifice. And then I'm going to become one with you. When you look at primitive traditions, when there was a war, warriors used to eat the bodies of prisoners of war. They used to eat the liver, they used to eat the heart. They believed that the qualities and properties of the prisoners of war,
if they were courageous,
by eating the heart, they would become courageous. If they were, or by eating the liver. So the child, by sacrificing his body, because in his mind there is a picture of a body, it's like a map. By sacrificing himself, the child acquires the properties of the false self.
Yeah.
Becomes one with the false self.
And what is the child sacrificing in actuality? Is the child at that point
Disappears.
It's actually sacrificing
Yes,
an authentic self.
Yes, disappear. A true self.
A true self.
The clinical term is true self.
Okay.
The child had existed up to this point. Up to the anxious depressive phase, the child made a clear distinction between himself and the imaginary friend.
What age did you say this typically happens?
About 4 to 6.
4 to 6, because of the interactions with external
With
objects.
outside, yes. Object relations.
Object relations.
Object relations.
And there's just too much negative feedback coming
Yes.
in. They're forced into the catch-22. Plunge into fantasy. I can't. Plunge into reality. I can't.
Yes.
So they do this.
So they say, okay, I'm going to disappear.
Yeah.
I can't be in reality. I can't be in fantasy.
Yeah.
Okay, I will not be.
I cannot be.
I cannot be. I will not be. But what do you mean I will not be? I must become something. Yeah, I will not be. How to not be?
Yeah.
I will not be by becoming my imaginary friend.
Okay.
I will merge with my I will become one with my imaginary friend. I will sacrifice myself as a human sacrifice to this God, and this God will subsume me, will become me. I will become this God, will become one. The minute the child does this, he actually solves the problem. Because as a false self, the child is above reality. Everything that reality has to offer is irrelevant to a God. A God, if there is a God. I don't think he pays attention whether we are drinking coffee or not, whether we are saying there's no God. Even if we both were to say there's no God, God wouldn't take offense. Because who are we to him? We're ants. We're nothing. In other words, the main function of the new false self is to devalue reality. We're beginning to see the origins of the idealization devaluation cycle. The child idealizes the false self and simultaneously devalues reality.
Sounds like the experience of religious mystics the
Yes,
world over.
it's a religion, absolutely religion.
Yeah. So
It's
they
an absolute religion.
forgo the material world, join with God, you know, okay.
Yes, but for grandiose reasons.
Yes, yes.
And so the child says, now I'm God, now I'm God. He idealizes the false self, and then he devalues reality.
Okay.
Which is exactly what he's going to do for the rest of his life. He's going to idealize himself by idealizing his partner, a process called co-idealization, and then he's going to devalue her because she represents reality. She's an external object.
You're part of that shitty
You're
world
part of
out
this
there.
world that is attacking me, doesn't see my value and my
Brilliance,
worth,
yeah.
doesn't realize my divinity, you know, so I'm devaluing you.
So then you would get the, oh, you're wonderful, you're wonderful. Oh no, you're just like them. You're just
Yes.
like everyone else.
This is very crucial to understand. All the dynamics that the child goes through are replicated in future relationships. The child cannot separate from the mother. He doesn't allow his partner to separate from him. He doesn't do separation. The child idealizes the false self. He idealizes the partner in order to idealize himself, of course. The child devalues reality. He devalues the partner because she's part of reality. This cycle lasts till the very end of life.
I understand everything that you're saying. I really hope people watching it can, because this is out there. This is tough.
Really?
I think so. I don't think it's normal. I don't know.
So now the child found a solution. By the way, the borderline and the narcissist found a solution. They have a false self. They identify with the false self, and everything is fine and dandy for a while. The borderline is regulated because the false self she has identified with is a soothing, comforting God. It's a loving God. It's a New Testament God.
Yeah.
The proto-narcissist child has identified with the false self, become one with the false self, and that is an Old Testament false self.
Punitive, envious,
Punitive,
jealous.
harsh, demanding, but also perfect, omniscient, omnipotent,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
It is not an accident that we have an Old Testament and a New Testament.
Oh, that's interesting.
Not an accident. These are two types of gods.
Okay.
And if, I don't want to go into it, but if I had to diagnose,
Yeah.
never mind.
You be careful, Mr.
Never mind, I'll be careful with that. Okay, Shushanim. Now, so now the two children, the proto-narcissist and proto-borderline found a solution. The fantasy is intact. They have become gods. Therefore, reality is devalued. The god is idealized, and they feel excellent. They feel comfortable for a while. But the problems start soon thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
The problem starts because at some point the life intrudes. Not reality, but life intrudes. The child has to, graduate school, go to the army, I don't know where, go find a job. Exigencies of life interpose, and there's no way to avoid them, ultimately. Whenever the child, now let's focus on the proto-narcissistic child.
Okay.
Whenever the proto-narcissist attempts to make a transition, starts a new job, starts to study something, has a new friendship, or whatever, the mother interjects, keeps warning him not to separate, not to be autonomous, not to develop autonomy, not to develop independence, not to develop agency. And this hampers, this obstructs the child's self-efficacy, his ability to act in and on the world in order to extract beneficial outcomes. He is obstructed with this. Yet he is a god. Again, a gap opens. Again, a gap opens. And this time, it's a performative gap, a functional gap, not an informational gap, because the first gap was simply information.
Yes.
But now, your actions defy you. Whatever you do, there's a sense of failure, a sense of being an imposter, the imposter syndrome. And so there needs to be another modification to the fantasy. Each time the fantasy is modified, the narcissist never ever chooses reality. Because the mother interject is too strong. He can never ever. The only thing he does, he modifies the fantasy. So now he modifies the fantasy to incorporate a mother figure. We'll stop here and we'll go back. We'll go to the borderline.
Okay.
The borderline similarly encounters difficulties when she faces life's demands and vicissitudes. She is not comforted anymore. She is not soothed. She is not regulated. She often dysregulates emotionally. She has mood lability, and so on and so forth. So the fantasy is no longer working. She needs to modify the fantasy as well. Similar to the narcissist, the borderline never transitions to reality.
Okay.
She modifies the fantasy. But there is a twist. The borderline's fantasy is object-centered. The narcissist, I will explain, don't worry. The narcissist fantasy is introject-centered. And I'll try to explain the difference. When the borderline is forced to modify her fantasy, what she does, she finds someone out there which is a kind of liaison to reality, a bridge to reality, a representation of reality. But it's a real person. It's blood, flesh and blood person. She finds someone out there. His job is to provide her with reality testing. Okay. He becomes her reality. If you talk to borderlines, they will tell you, he's my life.
Yeah.
He's my life, he's my world. He's my world. No. And he is. It's not a metaphor, not a simile. He is the borderline's life. Yeah. He is her world. Yeah. So she finds an external person, external object. This person is out there, so this is known as external object. She finds an external object, and then she relegates to him. She passes on to him all the functions in her that conflict with the fantasy.
Okay.
So, the first thing she passes on to this person is regulatory functions. The fantasy is supposed to stabilize the borderline, supposed to regulate her. So if she is dysregulated, it means the fantasy is failing. And she cannot afford this. If she comes to believe that the fantasy had failed, she will commit suicide. End of story.
Okay.
The minute a borderline reaches a point where her fantasy had failed, she commits suicide. That's 11% of borderlines.
Okay.
So, she cannot accept that the fantasy. So what she does, she takes everything in her, all the internal processes that conflict with the fantasy, and she hands them over to a partner. So she tells the partner, I'm dysregulated, please regulate me. Please regulate my emotions. My moods are up and down. Please stabilize my moods. She tells the partner, please change my internal processes so that they don't conflict with the fantasy, so that I don't have to get rid of the fantasy.
But based on what you're saying, would I be wrong then in assuming that between the borderline and the narcissist, the borderline actually applies more pressure on their partner because they need them more?
Much more, of course.
And the narcissist really can change you out. They can swap you if you fail.
Borderline annexes the partner. She appropriates the partner. She swallows the partner. She internalizes him. She assimilates him.
Yeah.
Very similar to the process of creating the false self. The borderline and the narcissist merge with the false self. They're swallowed by the false self. So now she swallows the external partner.
Okay.
But this is a concept that's very difficult to understand. Let me try to simplify even this. Borderline is a fantasy. The fantasy is, I am the false self. I'm God. And as God, I can regulate myself. As God, I can stabilize myself. As God, I can have inner peace. But then it doesn't work. It's not working.
Yeah.
She keeps getting dysregulated. She has mood lability. She is falling apart. And she says, bloody hell, am I lying to myself? Maybe I'm not God. And this is a forbidden thought. If she accepts that she's not God, she will commit suicide. Okay. It's death or God, nothing in between. So she finds someone and she says, listen, I'm at serious risk. My fantasy is not working. I don't know what's happening. I'm dysregulated, I'm labile, I'm this, I'm that. Can you help me with my fantasy, please? Can you please regulate me? Can you stabilize me? Can you comfort me? Can you soothe me so that I'm able to maintain my fantasy? Because then I will be regulated. If you regulate me, I'll be regulated. Yeah. If you stabilize me, I'll be stable. If you soothe and comfort me, I'll be comforted. And then I will have no problem to maintain the fantasy. So he becomes an extension of the fantasy. He becomes a facilitator of the fantasy. He enters the fantastic space. And together they create a shared fantasy. This is where the concept of shared fantasy comes from. He colludes with her in her fantasy, if he's a partner. Some people walk away. They say, what the hell? I don't want this. They walk away.
Is this where some people, psychologists, have suggested it vectors into fragile narcissism because of the shame that induces? I'm godlike, I'm wonderful, but my secret shame is I need this stupid human, this partner.
Covert narcissism is very close to borderline.
Okay.
Very close to borderline. The mechanisms there are a bit different.
Okay.
But it's very close to borderline. So if the partner is amenable to this suggestion, accepts his role in the fantasy, he becomes integrated in the fantasy, and he becomes a fantasy element. He becomes a figment of the fantasy, and in order for him to become a figment of the fantasy, she idealizes him. She idealizes the partner. So she photoshops him. It's like, she changes him so that he fits into the fantasy. Okay. From that moment, the partner regulates the internal environment of the borderline, which allows her to keep the fantasy, and everyone is happy.
Yes.
Until he doesn't. Yeah. And then she falls apart because it endangers the fantasy.
Will he inevitably fail?
Yes, he will inevitably fail.
Because the demands are just unrealistic?
Not because the demands are unrealistic. No? Actually, quite a few partners succeed.
Huh.
Because he has engulfment anxiety. So she has abandonment anxiety because he is her regulator. Right. He is the guarantor of the fantasy.
Yeah.
But he gets too close for comfort. He subsumes her. He consumes her.
Yeah.
Again, she experiences the trauma of disappearing. Do you remember ages ago when we discussed that the child vanishes?
Yes.
Disappears.
Yes.
Not seen as a narcissist.
Yes. And
bad object. So the child is never himself or herself. She disappears. She vanishes. With a partner, she experiences the same. The closer she gets to him, the more he is adept at regulating the fantasy or managing the fantasy, the more she is at his mercy. The more they become one, the more she vanishes.
I'm sorry, Sam. I apologize for existing. No. So then where we see relationships where...
You're just kidding yourself that you exist. I'm telling you, you don't exist.
I'm a figment of someone's imagination.
Yeah, someone's fantasy.
There is a thing, I'm sure you would have heard it as, in counselling as much as I would have, where when a relationship between a man and woman becomes too stable, the woman starts to create problems, dramas. Is this the same, could this be the same function?
Probably, yes.
The man is doing his job, and
Yes.
now she's
Yes.
fearing the engulfment,
Yes.
so in order to experience herself individuated,
Yeah.
she has to
Yes.
create trouble.
So this is what is known as approach, avoidance, repetition, compulsion.
Yes.
Push and pull.
Yeah.
I hate you, don't leave me.
And there's no borderline personality disordered relationship without that element there.
No.
There's some things maybe
This
yes,
is
maybe yes.
I repeat, it's not a popular message.
Yeah,
All these dynamics are preordained,
yeah,
predestined, immutable, incurable. All the rest are con artists who are selling snake oil.
okay.
End of story.
Okay.
These are lifelong dynamics.
Lifelong dynamics.
Period.
Yeah, okay.
Absolute period.
And so there will always be...
By the way, even when the borderline loses her diagnosis, because about 81% of borderlines lose their diagnosis after age 45, she doesn't lose this. She doesn't.
push-pull.
Yes.
Approach avoidance.
Yes. She doesn't lose this. So she approaches the partner because she wants him to eliminate the processes in her which challenge the fantasy.
Okay.
He does his job. He regulates her, he stabilizes her, he soothes her, he comforts her, he's constantly there. And then she feels trapped. She feels trapped, she feels imprisoned, shackled, smothered, suffocated. She feels she wants to run away.
So all of that intimacy that she was craving and the love that she was craving, when she actually succeeds in getting it, she becomes terrified.
In other words, the price she feels that she's paying for the maintenance of the fantasy is too high.
Okay.
The price is she disappears.
Yeah.
So she says, what the heck? I mean, okay, fantasy is nice, but I also want to be.
Yes.
So she runs away.
Okay.
Of course, the minute she runs away, the fantasy is threatened because her dysregulation starts and so on, and she runs back and away and back. And this is
I'm only laughing because I've been through this. I recognize it to the letter.
it's a classic dynamic. So the partner becomes an external regulator. This is the borderline solution to the onslaught of life and its demands, which threatens the fantasy. The main preoccupation of borderlines and narcissists is the maintenance of the fantasy. Fantasy matters more than anything, more than husbands, more than wives, more than children, more than money, not more. The fantasy is it.
Yeah.
This is it. This is who they are and what they do all the time. Okay, this is the borderline solution.
Yes.
And in this sense, the borderline is simpler than the narcissist, because she develops an approach avoidance with a partner, and the partner regulates her internal world, and essentially that's where it stops, and she gets stuck in these loops for life.
Okay.
The narcissist, as usual, complicates issues. When the narcissist goes out to life, of course, his fantasy is challenged as well. His fantasy is challenged as well, and he needs to find a solution exactly as the borderline did. His solution is actually fascinating. The narcissist says, life challenges me, and my fantasy is falling apart because I am not the core of my fantasy. Because in some ways he says, because the false self is not sufficiently differentiated, is not really out there. So he says, I'll try to explain how it's perceived by him. He says, life is challenging me, life is attacking me, life is contradicting me, life disagrees with me, life, is exigencies and vicissitudes and difficulties and tribulations and what have you. Because the false self is too close to me. Now you remember that the narcissist has a bad object, internalized bad object. It's like the narcissist says, the minute I merged, I became the false self, I contaminated it. I became contaminated.
Yeah.
I dragged it down. It was God, and when we merged, I dragged it down. Because I'm a bad object. I'm unworthy, I'm inadequate, I'm this, I'm that. So what I need to do, I need to break apart. I need to unleash the false self. Not render the false self not dependent on me.
Yeah.
Okay. How to do that? What is it actually? Separation. The narcissist feels the needs to go through separation, individuation. The false self in this sense is a kind of mother, becomes a kind of parental introject. Remember that in the previous phase, the child said, okay, the only solution to all the information that the environment provides me with, and which challenges me, the only solution is for me to become God.
Yeah.
So I will sacrifice myself to this new God and I will become this new God. But reality and life continue to, so the child says, I must have done something wrong. What have I done wrong? I'm a bad object. And I merged the false self with a bad object. So I brought it down, I made it less than God. I need to restore its divinity. And the only way to restore the divinity is to separate myself from this false self.
Yeah.
Separate myself from God. Allow God to be God,
Okay.
unadulterated by me. Okay, so I need to separate from God. Unbeknownst to the narcissist, or the narcissistic child, unbeknownst to him, he is trying to reenact the separation, individuation, which he did not complete with his mother.
Right.
He's trying to replay the separation, individuation, this time from an internal object. The internal object is a false self. Is it clear until now?
Yes.
Initially, the proto-narcissistic child merges with the imaginary friend, which had become the false self, renders the false self godlike, sacrifices himself like a human sacrifice, and disappears into the false self, merges, becomes one. When life continues to challenge the narcissist, because now, having done this, the child had become a narcissist. Now he's a full-fledged narcissist.
Yeah.
But life continues to challenge the narcissist, continues to hand the narcissist lemons. Narcissists are not very good at making lemonade. They just cut down the tree. So the child needs to modify the fantasy yet again, exactly as the borderline had modified her fantasy by introducing a real-life partner to regulate her environment. The narcissist needs to modify his fantasy for the second and last time, by the way. There are two modifications for borderline and two modifications for narcissist. So second and last time. To understand what goes on behind the scenes and why the narcissist makes the choice that he does when it comes to modifying the fantasy, we need to realize that idealization means divorcing reality.
Yeah.
When you idealize someone, it means you don't want the external real object. You want an idealized version of the real object, which is unreal. It's a fantasy. So when the child, as a proto-narcissist, had idealized the false self, he removed the false self from reality. He divorced the false self from reality.
Yeah.
And then in the second phase, the child merged with the false self. But when the child had merged with the false self, he brought into the false self the bad object. The child, remember, the proto-narcissistic child, is a bad object.
Yeah.
He fully believes himself to be inadequate, broken, vulnerable, fragile, insufficient, stupid, ugly. He believes himself to be like that. He believes it's real. He believes that the bad object is real. He had idealized the false self and removed the false self from reality. And then he merged with the false self and brought reality into the false self.
Yes.
He contaminated the false self with reality. Now the false self is no longer divorced from reality because it includes a bad object which is real and which used to be the child. So the false self cannot provide a defense against reality because it had become a part of reality. It is now in reality.
So it loses its power as a
It loses
fantasy.
power.
Yeah.
It loses its magical power because it used to be divorced from reality, the way God is divorced from the world. And now the child brought himself, his real bad object, into the false self and rendered the false self real.
Which diminishes it, brings it into the shitty reality.
Yes, and again, the false self cannot provide defense.
Yes.
So there's an urgent need to again idealize the false self, again render it fantastic, not real. How to do that? How to do that? The child needs to take the bad object away from the false self. The child has merged with the false self, and now what does he need to do? Separate from the false self.
But he's brought his poison, the thing that contaminates the amazingness of the false self, made it dirty. He realizes he's made it dirty, so now
and he needs to extract himself. He needs to purify the false self from the adulteration that is he.
Yeah.
So he needs to separate from the false self. And by separating from the false self, become an individual in reality.
Yes.
Protected by a fantastic false self, a god, in essence.
Yeah.
As long as the child is fully merged with the false self, the false self is helpless.
Yeah.
Is helpless because it's hampered, it's obstructed by the reality of the bad object.
Yes.
You need to remove reality from the false self, remove the bad object from the false self. Also because the false self is all good. It's a god. It's all good. It cannot have bad elements. There is splitting. There's a splitting defense. The child is all bad, the false self is all good. But the child had contaminated the false self and rendered the false self partly good, partly bad. What is partly good, partly bad? Reality. Reality is partly good, partly bad. So he needs to disentangle this. So he needs to separate from the false self and become an individual in reality. And that is separation, individuation. And that's exactly what the child does. He separates from the false self and creates an individual. At that moment, the mother intervenes. So what are you doing? Are you crazy? Why are you separating? I told you not to separate. You bad boy. You ugly, stupid, worthless, bad boy. You are separating. Don't separate. Now the conflict, the dissonance, is extreme. Because if he doesn't separate from the false self, he is not protected from reality.
Yeah.
If he does separate from the false self, his mother will kill him. What to do? You can't win. If you separate, mother will kill you. If you don't separate, reality will kill you. What to do? The solution that he finds is another mother. He says, one mother is torturing me, preventing me from separating. I'll find another mother. Which is, by the way, a child reaction. A child would tell mommy, "Mommy, I hate you. You're a bad mommy. I'm going to find another mommy." You know, which is what the narcissist does. He says, "I'm going to find another mother. And this time with this mother, I will negotiate acceptable separation individuation because I need to separate from the false self because I need to keep the false self fantastic and pure and godlike and all good. It's a must. I must preserve my fantasy. I must separate. Urgently, I must find another mother because this mother inside my head is not a good mommy. She wouldn't let me separate." Okay, so he goes out and he finds an intimate partner. Oh, by the way, not an intimate partner. A boss, a mentor, an intimate partner. Anyone could be this mother figure.
Yeah.
But in the vast majority of cases, it's an intimate partner. He finds an intimate partner and he forces her, coerces her into becoming his mother. He needs her to become his mother so that he can separate from her and individuate safely. He needs to do it safely. He needs her to encourage him to separate, to help him to individuate from the false self so that everything is settled again. The fantasy is intact, the false self is God and all good, and he is separate. So he needs a cooperating mother, a mother who is cooperative. So he finds an intimate partner and he says, "Will you be my mother? You'll be my mother." Of course, he doesn't tell her, "I'm about to separate from you and individuate from you," but he says, "Will you be?" And he doesn't know actually. He doesn't realize, all these dynamics are unconscious. It's not like the narcissist is sitting with my diagram and model and says, "I'm now in stage 443. Narcissist doesn't know what he's doing. It's totally unconscious.
And it's driven by pain and discomfort and drives and interjects.
Dissonance, ego dystony, severe anxiety, severe, overwhelming. And so he needs to, it's kind of dysregulation. He needs to regulate himself. He finds an intimate partner, he converts her into his mother. How does he convert an intimate partner into his mother? For example, he becomes helpless. He relies on her to do all kinds of things. He suddenly is unable to cope, so he needs her to take care of him the way a mother takes care of a very small child. And so he shoehorns her, he forces her into the role of a mother. Now that she is a mother, he is ready for the next stage, which is separation, individuation. And to separate from her, he needs to devalue her. To understand why he needs to devalue, we need to go back. When a narcissist comes across a potential intimate partner, the first thing he does, he takes a snapshot of her. He takes a photograph of her, mental photograph, and he internalizes this photograph. He internalizes this photograph, and he photoshops it. He kind of idealizes it. This is idealization. He photoshops the snapshot. That moment, she is ideal, so he is ideal, because she belongs to him. She's his extension. She's a property. She's inside his mind. She's an internal object. So if she is ideal, he's ideal. This is co-idealization. Okay. Now, stage one. Stage two, he converts her into a mother. A mother needs to be ideal. The reason narcissists idealize their partner and thereby themselves is the mother needs to be ideal. The narcissist, at that point, regresses to age 18 months. The mother needs to be godlike. I mean, the ideal mother, the perfect mother. So he idealizes her. He regresses to age 18 months, and the process starts. He needs, at some point, to separate. To separate from her, he needs a reason. He needs to tell himself some story. He needs some narrative. Why? Because he has idealized her. How do you explain to yourself separating from an ideal object? Sounds stupid, no?
Yeah.
Why would you separate from an ideal object? Moreover, you chose this object. It was your judgment, your decision. So you are less than all-knowing. You are less than omniscient. You are less than godlike because you've made a mistake.
Yeah.
If you want to separate from your intimate partner that you have selected, your selection process sucks. You are fallible. You make mistakes. You're bad judge of character. You're less than perfect. So this creates narcissistic injury. The very thought of separating from her creates immediately narcissistic injury. Narcissistic injury creates anxiety, and he needs to reduce it. How to reduce his anxiety? By devaluing her. But he cannot devalue her as she is, because she is idealized. So he says, I keep the introject, and I devalue her. The introject is ideal. I have made no mistake. Here, there's proof. The introject is here. It's ideal. No mistake. I never make mistakes. Ever. Except talking to you. But what I can do, I can devalue the external object.
This is the introject that he has, is the snapshot, the idealized snapshot that he took at the beginning of the relationship.
Yes, exactly.
So to be clear, what he's holding on to is dead.
It's a snapshot.
It's a snapshot. It's not a living...
Not a living. In a minute, we'll come to the issue of object constancy and introject constancy. Suffice it to say that he has a real life intimate partner.
Yes.
Let's call it external object.
Yeah.
And he has an internal object, which is the representation of that real life partner in his mind.
This external object will be attacked
Devalued,
and devalued.
Yes.
This will remain intact.
Intact. Why? For two reasons. Why wouldn't he devalue the introject? If he devalues the introject, he has to admit that the idealization process was mistaken, and he never makes mistakes. It challenges his grandiosity and destroys the fantasy. So he cannot admit that there was a mistake in the introjection process.
Would he still be drawing some kind of supply from this internalized object?
We'll come to it when we talk about hoovering.
Okay.
So he cannot devalue the introject for this reason. There's another reason he cannot devalue the introject. Because he never relates to external objects. The narcissist relates only to internal objects. He emotionally invests in internal objects. He interacts with internal objects. He has fights and dialogues and debates and arguments with internal objects. He modifies internal objects. Nothing goes on with the external object. So, if he were to devalue the internal object and then discard it, he would develop abandonment anxiety. It's exactly like for healthy people to get rid of a real partner. Let me repeat this in a more. The narcissist's real partner is inside his head, never outside.
So he can lose, for the narcissist, not the borderline, he can afford to lose an external person. He cannot afford to lose. Okay.
Yes. Okay. When he loses the external person, he's happy-go-lucky. He moves on to the next partner, overnight sometimes. He has no abandonment anxiety, nothing. But if he were to lose her representation in his mind, he would develop severe abandonment anxiety and would stop functioning.
When you, this isn't, I've listened to your YouTube videos and we've discussed it, it's not completely new to me, but the way you just described it now makes me realize how much validity is to your assertion that this really is a psychotic.
It's almost psychotic. I'm not the first to say it.
Okay.
Kernberg said it.
This is because it's all.
It's almost psychotic.
It's an internal loop.
Yes, really it's almost psychotic. The narcissist lives completely inside his mind, and I fully concur with Kernberg that narcissism is a near psychotic state, a permanent near psychotic state.
Okay.
And that narcissists very often cross into psychosis. I concur with this.
So there's an internal world that they live in.
Yeah.
It's actually quite stable compared to other psychotics.
It's stable because they emotionally invest in it. They affect. There is cathexis.
Yeah.
They emotionally invest in it, and they don't allow it to change.
Right.
They fixate it.
It's not that chaotic inside there, then, really.
It's not chaotic at all. Everyone has his role.
It's ordered.
Ordered. Yeah. Very ordered. Rigid, actually.
Rigid. Yeah.
And that's why narcissism is defined as a rigid pattern of ta-ta-ta.
Okay.
It's rigidity. And that's why narcissists are very bad at coping with developments, exigencies, change. They're very bad at this because they're rigid.
Right.
They're not reacting to the outside. They're reacting to representations of the outside in their mind, and these representations are rigid. They're not flexible. They don't react flexibly.
Sorry, just a quick question. When we see narcissists actually being quite resilient and robust to external change, and that some people say, oh, they're healthy, they're not falling apart.
No,
there's chaos around them.
They're rigid.
So it's actually their internal rigidity can protect them from external change.
Well, all of narcissism is a defense.
Yeah.
It's
so
a defense against.
If they're good at it, they could seem very robust compared to other people with mental
health
issues.
They're actually extremely fragile and so on, but their rigidity protects them. Yes.
Okay.
So they have as Adler said actually, there's a core of inferiority, and so narcissism is compensatory, and it's rigid. It's like having an exoskeleton. Imagine that you don't have an internal skeleton, but you have an external skeleton, and it holds you firm.
It keeps you locked in place. And just to be clear on this other point, you're actually saying there isn't a distinct diagnosis called compensatory narcissism. What you're now saying is all narcissism is compensatory.
All narcissism is compensatory.
But this is new as well, right?
Yes, we used to think differently.
Okay.
But in the last 10 years, we are beginning to realize that all narcissism is compensatory.
This is mainstream
and this
psychology.
is the alternative model in the DSM.
Right.
In the DSM-5, all narcissism is compensatory.
This is a mainstream view.
That's a mainstream view.
Okay.
It didn't used to be, but now it is. And of course, the greatest minds like Kernberg and Milon, they insisted that it's compensatory. Kohut, they all insisted.
They all
said it's
okay.
compensatory.
Okay.
Okay, so the narcissist cannot get rid of the introject, cannot devalue the introject, because he will experience abandonment anxiety, because to his mind, the only real object is inside, not outside. So the outside is dispensable, is interchangeable.
You're going to leave, okay, leave.
Yeah, it's commodity.
Yeah.
So he devalues her.
Okay.
And he devalues her or his intimate partner by saying she has changed, she's under bad influence of her friends, her family is poisoning her against me. He's attributing to her change. Whereas the introject is immutable, never changes. The external object can and does change in the inexorable process of devaluation and discard. Now, to be very clear, devaluation and discard has nothing to do with the intimate partner. Nothing. This process has to do with the narcissist's need to separate and individuate from a substitute mother, which in turn is introjected in any case. So it's totally internal. There's nothing to do with the partner. Nothing the partner can do to prevent this.
Right. So in a therapeutic context, as much as that a client might be going through terrible pain through the sense of rejection from devaluation and discard, it has to be explained to them, at least they need to understand, at least theoretically, it's really not about you.
No.
And it's inevitable.
Yes.
You can't stop it from
You
happening.
can't stop it from happening.
Every narcissist will eventually have to devalue and discard you.
Yes.
Okay.
Because it's the only way to separate and individuate. When this happens and the external object is devalued, there is a temporary problem because there is a gap opening between the external object and the introject. This gap creates anxiety. By the way, even before devaluation, even prior to devaluation, when the external object deviates or diverges from the snapshot, for example, when the intimate partner becomes independent or autonomous, makes her own decisions, goes on a trip, develops new friendships, she deviates from the snapshot. She becomes autonomous, she has agency.
Yeah.
This threatens the narcissist because the snapshot has to be static.
Yeah.
The ideal partner for the narcissist is an ancient Egyptian mummy. Any ancient Egyptian mummy would do. So the minute there is a gap between the external object and the introject that represents the internal object, this creates anxiety. In the devaluation phase, the anxiety is maximal because the external object is devalued and the internal object is still idealized. The tension between the two is infinite almost.
Yeah.
So to resolve this, the narcissist half-heartedly attempts to hand over the introject. It's a very interesting process. He tries to kind of match the introject to the external object. He would tell his partner, you know, you have changed, but you are still amazing. So he would make contradictory statements. He would say, I can't trust you, but you've always been my best friend. Or, I don't know, you're a slut, but you're very pure. Or this kind of contradictory statements.
Yeah.
This is an attempt to hand over the introject, to match the introject with the devalued external object.
To get rid of it?
Get rid of it.
Okay.
But he can never do this.
He has to
It's a doomed attempt.
Okay.
Because the minute he tries to hand over the introject, that minute he experiences tremendous abandonment anxiety. Because his only real relationship was with the introject. And the introject is idealized. Who wants to lose an ideal partner? He experiences enormous. And he begins to experience depressive symptoms like hopelessness. He says, I will never find someone like that. He's not like that, external. Like that. I will never find an introject like that.
That is actually this. Okay,
yes. Yes. And so he becomes depressive, becomes anxious, abandonment anxiety is enormous, and he stops. He withdraws the introject back.
Okay, takes it back.
And he gets stuck with the introject for life. So narcissists have libraries of introjects, all of them active, all of them idealized, which explains hoovering. This is exactly the reason for hoovering. As long as the introject exists in the narcissist's mind, and there is a devalued external object somewhere, already discarded, but still alive, there is this tension.
Yeah.
The narcissist at some point is overwhelmed by the anxiety, and he needs to rematch. And so what he does, he re-idealizes the partner. He re-idealizes the partner so that it matches the introject, reduces the anxiety, and this is hoovering. Now, not all narcissists hoover all the time, and you could ask why. If that's a general mechanism, why not all narcissists hoover all the time? It depends crucially on whether they have found a substitutive maternal figure that can be matched with the introject. So they have a library of introjects. Okay? If they find an intimate partner whose profile matches one of the active introjects, then there would be no need for hoovering.
Okay.
It's only when there are many active introjects with no counterpart or no corresponding external object that they would then default to some former
Yes.
lover or,
Yeah.
and would re-idealize her
Yeah.
so that she matches the introject.
Right.
This is I coined a new phrase to describe this. I must say that I'm extremely shocked that no one in the whole history of psychology has suggested this, and not to aggrandize myself, but I'm simply shocked. It's a statement of fact. So I think it's so obvious. I coined the phrase introject constancy. Now, to understand what is introject constancy, I need to talk about object constancy.
Please.
And we're nearing the end, by the way, so your end. So,
The merciful end.
so we need to talk about object constancy. You remember that the borderline, in this also there is a difference between narcissist and borderline.
Yeah.
You remember the borderline maintains her fantasy
Yes.
by finding an external object, a real person,
A real person.
who helps her to regulate her internal environment so that this internal environment corresponds, matches
Yeah.
the fantasy.
Yes.
Okay, the fantasy is I'm regulated, I'm stable, I'm peace of mind, I'm happy. The partner helps her to be regulated, stable, happy with a peace of mind. So the fantasy is intact.
Okay.
Everyone is settled. Okay. To be able to do this, to be able to allow the partner to function inside her, she needs the partner's presence to be guaranteed. She needs to have a guaranteed presence of the partner. The
Yeah.
partner needs to be there
Yeah.
all the time. By the way, all the time. Like not a minute away. It needs to be there all the time. And this is called and the partner is there. As long as the partner is there, she trusts the partner to be there even when there are difficulties so this is called object constancy.
Yeah.
Object constancy is the belief or the conviction that an external object will remain in your life regardless of difficulties or friction, or that there is some bond or alliance or which are stronger than any temporary difficulties. So the borderline develops object constancy with her intimate partner, but not introject constancy.
And to be clear, object constancy is very difficult for borderlines, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. They
Very.
really struggle.
They really struggle a lot.
And is a part of object constancy if they're not interacting with the person, that their sense of the person
No.
starts to diminish?
No.
Yeah.
That's a mistake in psychology.
Oh, is it really?
That's what shocked me.
Oh, okay.
Every human being, even in Liverpool, develop
You said human being.
human being, human beings and the citizens of Liverpool. Whenever they come across someone meaningful, significant, they develop an introject. Introjection, internalization, introjection, known as identification, is an automatic process whenever someone means something to you. Whenever someone fulfills an important role in your life, they remain stuck in your mind. That's an introject. Obviously, the borderline develops an introject. So when she finds an intimate partner, he is constant as an object, as an external object, but she creates an introject of him because he's meaningful, significant. She can maintain the constancy of the object,
Okay.
but she cannot maintain the constancy of the introject. When the object is away, the introject degrades and fades.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. So the actual notion of object constancy is off.
Is off, wrong. Is wrong. They confuse in psychology introject constancy with object constancy.
So even in psychology, when we're discussing object relations theory, we've made a mistake between the internal and the external.
Yes. And that is what shocked me.
Right.
I can't understand to this very day how
Yeah.
no one came up with the idea that there is a constancy of introjects,
Yes,
not
yes.
only of objects.
Yes.
It is exceedingly clear in borderline because when the borderline is with her partner, is definitely constant.
Sure.
She treats him as constant. She relies on him. She hugs him. She hangs on him. She hangs on his every word. He's her life. He's her universe. He regulates her internal processes. He is her reality test. He is everything. He's absolutely everything. Of course, he's constant. How would he not be constant and fulfill all these roles? But the minute he leaves the room, she begins to doubt. The minute he leaves the room, the introject begins to degrade to the point that it vanishes.
Yeah.
And she has no representation of him in her mind.
Yeah.
It's like he never existed. Or she develops extreme abandonment anxiety because she can't hang on to the introject. There's no introject.
Yeah.
She can't hang on to it.
Yeah.
Healthy people, if I am in love with, I'm not healthy, but if I were healthy and I were in love with someone, she would leave the room and I would remember her. I would hang on to the memory, emotions, and I would hang on to the memory. This memory is the introject. I would hang on to the introject until she returns. She goes on a trip of 2 weeks. It's not that after 2 weeks I will ask her, excuse me, who are you? I will hang on to the introject. The introject will keep the continuity.
Yes.
But if I'm a borderline and she goes on a trip for 2 weeks, the introject will vanish, and I will not be able to hang on to anything.
Is that because borderlines have a diminished capacity to create stable introjects?
No, it's because their fantasy is object-oriented. Their fantasy is outward-oriented, not inward-oriented.
Okay, they're not the narcissist.
They're cathected. They're emotionally invested in objects,
right,
not in introjects. There's a finite amount of energy.
Yes.
Either you use it outside or you use it inside.
Yes.
You can't do both.
Yes.
So in healthy people, they divide it. So a little outside, a little inside.
Sure.
But if you're extremely intense, all the energy will go out, or all the energy will go in. If it goes all out, you're borderline. If it goes all in, you're narcissist. So the borderline, when she's with the object physically, she has object constancy.
Yeah.
The minute he goes or disappears or travels or I don't know what, or doesn't pay her attention, is on the phone for 2 hours, the introject degrades, falls apart, and she has nothing to hang on to.
Yeah.
And she feels abandoned, and she develops enormous anxiety. That's why borderlines are clingy. That's exactly the reason, because they need to go to the external object to help them to redevelop the introject. So their introjects are on the fly. They develop introjects millions of times, whereas a healthy person develops an introject for life, essentially.
Yeah.
The borderline would need to develop an introject every single time, every hour, I don't know, every day. No one can measure this. But all the time.
Sure.
She is busy developing introjects all the time because they don't hold. I have worked once with a forum of borderlines. And they told me,
And you survived?
I survived. They survived. They told me something very interesting. Not all of them, of course. Some of them used to take, when they left home, they used to take an object belonging to the husband. They used to take a handkerchief, a photograph, a linchpin. They used to take something, a tie, cufflinks. They used to take something belonging to the husband. And they said that throughout the day, they would touch these objects when they were attracted to other men. I'm not kidding you. Because they don't have introjects.
Yeah.
They don't have introjects.
They had to have a physical reminder.
Something physical.
That there was another man.
Yeah.
That
you know what it reminds me? When you go to mediums, spiritual mediums, they tell you, can you give me something that belonged to the saint?
To bring them back, to bring their spirit into the room.
Yes. The spirit is the introject, if you wish.
Yeah.
So the borderline does this.
They have to summon them.
Summon them. Absolutely summon them. Absolutely.
Husband, are you there?
Husband, are you there? Let me hold the, oh, you touched this bottle a few hours ago. He exists. He's there. There's no introject constancy.
So it looks, from the outside, it looks like moral degeneracy. You'd be like, oh, as soon as your husband's not there, you do whatever you want. But
yes.
It's actually that there is no...
Out of sight, out of mind.
There's no husband anymore.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Or wife, if you're a borderline man.
Yes. It's out of sight, out of mind. Simple. No mind. Nothing in the mind. Out of sight, nothing in the mind. The narcissist is opposite. The narcissist has introject constancy, and that's the new concept that I invented.
Right.
And that's the shock.
Yeah.
That no one came up with this concept.
Yeah.
Which to me, how can you not have introject? Of course, if there are external objects and you have introjects, there's constancy there, there's constancy here. Must be. But for some reason, everyone talks about object constancy.
The way that you're using the term introject, is that yours, or is that mainstream object relations theory?
Mainstream.
Okay.
Only no one thought of the idea that you have to maintain the introjects.
Yeah.
in a state of constancy.
Yes.
So the narcissist is exactly the opposite. As far as this is concerned, the external object degrades and fades. The external object degrades and fades, especially if it's absent.
Yeah.
But not only. Also when it's present. That's the difference with the borderline.
Yeah.
Even when the external object is present, even when it's loving, even when it's caring, even in sex, even in, you name it, the object keeps degrading. You know, this, it's like the object is flickering. Like the object is flickering in and out of existence.
Like quantum physics or something.
Yeah, kind of. It's like zzz, zzz, you know. So you're not sure if it's real. It's flickering there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the introject of the object, the internal representation of the object, the avatar of the object in your mind is stable as rock.
Okay.
It's actually rigid. It's rigid and it's stable because it doesn't really represent the external object. It's idealized. It represents your emotional investment in the avatar and your need to separate individually. So it ties into very deep dynamics.
Could the internalized introject in narcissism, could it actually be quite divergent from the reality of the person?
It's always divergent.
Because
it's idealized.
I had an experience where, with a girl where towards the end of the relationship, as I was walking slowly towards the door and we were breaking up and getting back together and going to therapy, she would go through these episodes and she would talk to me about me with attributes that had nothing to do, even interests that were nothing to do. She started talking about me gambling, and I was like, is that I've never gambled in my life. Is that an export? Who are you talking about?
Yeah.
But the internal clearly wasn't matching.
You could say
me.
that the internal has a life of its own.
You're right.
In a way, has a life of its own. It never changes its idealized features.
Sure.
But it has a life of its own. In the sense that, for example, you break up with a narcissist.
Yeah.
And you will come back together 10 years later.
Right.
And the narcissist will proceed as if no time has passed.
Yes.
He will take it from the last moment.
Yes.
And he was like you met yesterday, not 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Because in his mind, the introject is fixated. It's rigid. It's immutable. And therefore, it's normal for him, because he interacts only with the internal object, not with you. It's normal for him to continue where you've taken off,
Yes.
where you've stopped.
Yeah.
So this is the difference between borderline and all this mess is intended to preserve the fantasy. Now the fantasy is shared.
Yeah.
It's shared in the sense that the borderline introduces an object into the fantasy in order to essentially preserve it, and the narcissist introduces an introject into the fantasy in order to preserve it. But it's shared. It's always shared. And I think the message to victims of narcissists and so on, there's a painful message and a hopeful message. And the painful message is you were never chosen. You're not special. You're utterly commodified. You're interchangeable. None of your properties or qualities were relevant because the narcissist interacts with a concoction, with a piece of fiction that loosely hangs on you but has little to do with you. So you're nobodies. You're nobodies in the narcissist world. You've never been meaningful or significant. You're not a significant other, you're an insignificant other. And
it's not possible to be significant.
Not
as
possible.
such.
There's no significance in external object.
Yeah.
All the significance, cathexis, all the emotional investment is in the internal object.
Cathexis, I think.
Emotional investment.
They're pouring the energy into the thing to make it meaningful and powerful. So they imbue. It's very religious. They imbue meaning into you when they decide to, but not really you.
Not
just the image of you.
Your avatar. Yes.
We are so irrelevant to narcissists.
To narcissists, you are irrelevant.
Really, utterly irrelevant.
This is the painful message.
Yeah.
And the hopeful message is none of it was your fault, and you could have done nothing about it.
That's really important.
None of it was your fault, and you could have done nothing whatsoever about it.
So if your mind is torturing you, if you'd said this, you went to therapy, you did this, that, the other thing, whether it's a borderline or a narcissist, it was doomed from the outset and would have played out pretty much in exactly that way.
It's not about you, it's about them. Okay. It's not about you, it's about them. And it has to do with their compulsive need to preserve a fantasy. So it's not about reality even. There's no way you could have modified the fantasy, entered the fantasy meaningfully, changed it. I mean, no, they defend the fantasy ferociously. And they even sacrifice themselves for the sake of the fantasy. Fantasy dominates. Narcissism is a fantasy defense gone awry, writ large. Same with borderline. These are fantasy defenses. The minute people value fantasy more than reality, you have no role, you have no place, and you have no contribution, negative or positive. You're not there, you're not relevant. You're an excuse, you're a trigger. I don't know what to call you, but you're definitely not a partner, not a lover, not a... The attempt to impose on narcissism and borderline the language of health and normalcy is doomed. So
again, just as we approach the end of the interview, speaking therapeutically, it's a mistake for therapists, counselors, and clients to even attempt to
make sense of it.
Yeah, and any sort of healthy, and a warning, I suppose, you will be tempted to. You're going to try and apply healthy coordinates to borderlines and narcissists, and you really can't.
No, you can't, because these people are no longer with us. They are not embedded in reality. They react badly to reality, actually, and you're part of reality.
Yeah.
Unless you want to suspend yourself or change yourself in highly pathological ways, it's possible. But otherwise, you're part of reality, and there's nothing borderlines and narcissists dread and hate more than reality. You're an agent. You're an agent of another kingdom, which is the enemy. You're an enemy. You're what we call a persecutory object. You end up being an enemy.
Yes.
Because you bring reality into the lives of the borderline and the narcissist and challenge the fantasy.
So for people who've been partners of narcissists and borderlines, I've had the experience of my partner insisting on viewing me as an enemy. This is why.
Yes, you are the enemy.
Right.
You are the enemy because think of reality and fantasy as Ukraine and Russia.
Okay.
Okay, so
which
one's
Russia. Reality, which one's fantasy?
Well, let's say reality is Ukraine and fantasy is Russia.
Yeah.
You're Ukrainian. You're Ukrainian to Russia.
And that's it. Yeah. There's nothing else.
There's a war. It's a war.
So when everything is sort of positioned as a competition, as aggression, as hostile, you can literally, I've had the experience, anything you do can be perceived as hostile. Offering a cup of tea could be hostile or patronizing or condescending. Or
offering a cup of tea, first of all, is an intrusion by reality. It's a reminder.
It's British colonialism.
Yes, it's British colonialism. It's a reminder of reality.
Yeah.
In the case of the narcissist, it's also a narcissistic injury.
Yeah.
So if you offer the narcissist advice, for example, you imply that he's less than omniscient, or all-knowing.
Yeah.
If you offer empathy, you imply that he's pitiful or in need of empathy. In need of. What do you mean in need of? God doesn't need anything. You're challenging grandiosity. In the case of the borderline, if you offer her advice or empathy, you are challenging the fantasy because you are broadcasting to her. You are dysregulated. I mean, if I come to the borderline and say, listen, I really empathize. I understand what you're going through. That's bad strategy, because it's like saying you're dysregulated now.
Yeah.
And if you're dysregulated now, your fantasy is at risk.
Yeah.
So there is no winning strategy.
Okay. That's what I was going to ask you. Is there a strategy?
No, there is no winning strategy. These people are not built for relationships. They're in relationships. They're deeply wedded and committed to their fantasies. End of story.
Herr Professor Doctor.
Herr Professor Dr. Wacken.
Professor Dr. Wacken, thank you very much for the explanation.
Thank you for suffering me.
I appreciate it. I'm sure the people watching appreciate it.
I finally understood what I'm saying.
You finally understood?
I understood.
So if people want to know more, they can follow you on your channel, the Sam Vaknin channel.
Yes, there's actually a lot more than what we were able to discuss, because now we try to simplify. I had to eliminate many side dishes. There's a lot more in the video titled 7 Phases of something. So if you go to my channel...
Devaluation, I think.
Devaluation or something.
Yeah.
There's a video that starts with 7 phases. There's only one.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot more in terms of other mechanisms at work and so on. I've eliminated a lot. I honed in on the core.
On the core of it. Okay. Well, thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you for having me and for giving me this opportunity to explain to myself what the heck am I doing. I've been doing for the last 6 years.
Ladies and gents, thank you for your time and for your attention, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.